But there's a moment quiet, almost invisible when two people meet and something deeper than attraction begins to unfold. Not chemistry, not coincidence, but pattern. Today, I want to talk about what happens when an avoidant meets a healed empath, because this is not your typical love story. At first, it feels magnetic. The avoidant is drawn to the empath's warmth, their depth, their ability to understand without words. And the empath, they feel seen in a way that feels rare, almost like they've found someone worth opening up to. But here's where the story usually used to go wrong. In the past, the empath would overgive. They would chase clarity, try to earn love, and slowly lose themselves trying to hold on to someone emotionally unavailable. But this is a healed empath, and that changes everything. Because now, when the avoidant pulls away, the empath doesn't panic. They pause. They observe. They don't rush in to fix, to prove, or to convince. They simply stand still in their own worth. And suddenly, the dynamic shifts. The avoidant, who is used to distance creating pursuit, is met with something unfamiliar, space that isn't chasing them. And that space is confronting, because now, the avoidant has to face something they've always avoided, not the other person, but themselves. The healed empath becomes a mirror, calm, grounded, unshaken. They don't play games. They don't abandon themselves. And most importantly, they don't stay where they are not chosen. And this is the turning point, because one of two things happens. Either the avoidant leans in, slowly learning that love doesn't have to feel like pressure, that closeness doesn't mean losing freedom, or they retreat further, unable to meet the standard of emotional presence being offered. But here's the truth. The healed empath understands. Not every connection is meant to be completed. Some are meant to reveal, to teach, to show you just how much you've grown. So the healed empath doesn't fight for potential. They choose reality. They choose consistency. They choose themselves. And in doing so, they create something powerful, a relationship dynamic where love is no longer about proving your worth, but about recognizing it. And that is where real connection begins. What often feels like instant chemistry between an avoidant and an empath isn't necessarily a sign of deep compatibility. It's usually the pull of emotional contrast. The avoidant tends to value independence, space, and self-protection, often keeping their emotions guarded or at a distance. The empath, on the other hand, is naturally attuned to emotions, connection, and understanding. They feel deeply, notice subtleties, and instinctively move toward closeness rather than away from it. When these two energies meet, it can create a powerful sense of intrigue, almost like each person has found something in the other that they themselves lack. For the avoidant, the empath's warmth can feel incredibly comforting at first. It's disarming to find someone who is open, patient, and willing to understand without demanding immediate vulnerability in return. The empath creates a safe emotional space, which can make the avoidant feel seen without pressure, at least in the beginning. This can draw them in quickly because it feels different from the emotional expectations they may be used to avoiding. For the empath, the avoidant can feel like a mystery worth solving. There's depth beneath the surface, even if it isn't fully expressed. The moments when the avoidant does open up even slightly can feel incredibly meaningful, almost like a reward. The empath may interpret this as potential, believing that with enough patience and care, a deeper connection will naturally unfold. This belief can intensify the attraction because it feels like there's something real waiting to be uncovered. But this dynamic is less about alignment and more about contrast. Each person is responding to what is unfamiliar in the other. The empath is drawn to the challenge and depth of someone who doesn't easily open up, while the avoidant is drawn to the ease and emotional generosity of someone who doesn't demand too much too soon. It creates a sense of balance on the surface, but underneath, it can lead to tension if both people remain in their default patterns. The empath may begin to lean in more, sensing distance and trying to bridge it. The avoidant may begin to pull back, sensing closeness and trying to maintain their comfort zone. What initially felt like a perfect complement can slowly turn into a push and pull dynamic where each person's natural response triggers the other's defense mechanism. This is why the attraction can feel so strong. It's not just about liking each other, it's about activating something deeper. The empath feels engaged by the possibility of connection, while the avoidant feels both intrigued and unsettled by it. Without awareness, this can create a cycle where both people mistake intensity for compatibility, when in reality, they are simply responding to the emotional differences between them. A healed empath approaches connection very differently from how they might have in the past, and this shift completely alters the dynamic. Where they once may have felt compelled to prove their worth through giving, understanding, and emotional labor, they now recognize that real connection doesn't require them to overextend themselves. They no longer confuse being needed with being valued. In earlier patterns, the empath might have responded to inconsistency by leaning in harder, sending longer messages, offering more reassurance, trying to decode mixed signals, and ultimately prioritizing the other person's comfort over their own emotional stability. There was a quiet belief operating underneath it all. If they just loved well enough, the other person would meet them there. But a healed empath no longer operates from that belief. Instead of reacting immediately, they take a step back, allow space for clarity. They don't rush to fill silence or chase after someone who has pulled away. If communication becomes inconsistent, they notice it without trying to justify it. If effort feels one-sided, they acknowledge it rather than compensating for it. This doesn't come from coldness, it comes from self-respect. Patience, in this case, doesn't mean waiting endlessly or tolerating emotional unavailability. It means giving situations enough time to reveal themselves without interference. The healed empath understands that people show who they are through patterns, not promises. So instead of trying to manage the outcome, they observe the behavior. This is where the biggest shift happens. They respond instead of pursue. If someone shows up with consistency, they meet that energy fully and openly. If someone becomes distant, they don't chase, they mirror the space. Not as a strategy, but as a boundary. Their actions are no longer driven by fear of losing the connection, but by alignment with their own emotional standards. They are still deeply compassionate, but that compassion is no longer self-sacrificing. They can understand someone's wounds without making it their responsibility to heal them. They can hold space for another person's struggles without abandoning their own needs in the process. And perhaps most importantly, they are no longer attached to potential. They don't stay in situations because of what could be, they stay because of what is. This grounded perspective allows them to engage in relationships with openness, but also with discernment. So when they encounter someone who is avoidant, their instinct is no longer to chase or fix. It is to stay centered, to remain emotionally available without overreaching, and to let the other person meet them halfway or not at all. This quiet strength changes everything, because it removes the imbalance that once defined the connection. When the empath stops pursuing, something subtle but powerful pushes us happens beneath the surface of the connection. The dynamic that once felt predictable begins to shift, and the avoidant, often without realizing it, is placed in unfamiliar emotional territory. In the past, distance created pursuit. Pulling away gave them space while still keeping the connection intact because the other person would bridge the gap. But now, that pattern no longer works. Instead of being met with reassurance, messages, or attempts to reconnect, the avoidant is met with stillness. And that stillness can feel louder than any words. At first, they may interpret it as disinterest or assume the connection is fading. But over time, something deeper begins to surface. Without someone chasing them, there's no external distraction from their own emotional habits. The usual rhythm: withdraw, get space, return when comfortable is interrupted. And in that interruption, awareness has a chance to grow. For someone who is avoidant, distance has often been a form of control. It allows regulate emotional intensity, avoid vulnerability, and maintain a sense of independence. But when the other person no longer reacts to that distance, it removes the safety net they didn't even realize they were relying on. Now, the question becomes internal instead of external. Do they actually want this connection, or were they simply comfortable in the dynamic? Do they miss the person or just the attention? Do they feel ready to engage more deeply, or do they retreat further into familiar patterns? This is where confrontation happens, not through conflict, but through absence of the usual response. The avoidant is left alone with their own tendencies, without someone softening the impact or compensating for their withdrawal. And that can be uncomfortable, because it requires a level of self-reflection they may have spent years avoiding. For some, this becomes a turning point. They begin to recognize the cost of their emotional distance. They may start to question why closeness feels threatening, or why they instinctively pull away when things become real. This awareness can lead to small but meaningful shifts, initiating contact, expressing more, or at least attempting to stay present instead of disappearing. For others, the discomfort reinforces their habitual patterns. Instead of leaning into the connection, they withdraw even more, choosing the familiarity of distance over the uncertainty of vulnerability. Without the empath pursuing them, the connection no longer feels sustainable and they let it fade rather than adapt. What's important here is that the shift doesn't come from pressure or persuasion. It comes from the absence of it. The empath's decision to stop chasing doesn't force change, it reveals the truth. It creates a space where the avoidant's intentions, readiness, and emotional capacity become clear through their actions rather than their words. And in that clarity, the dynamic either evolves into something more balanced or it ends without confusion. As the dynamic shifts, what once felt emotionally confusing begins to sharpen into something much clearer. The push and pull that defined the connection starts to lose its grip, not because both people have suddenly changed, but because one of them, the healed empath, is no longer participating in the imbalance. And without that participation, the relationship can no longer hide behind mixed signals or emotional ambiguity. In the past, inconsistency may have been rationalized. Delayed replies, hot and cold behavior, moments of closeness followed by distance, all of it might have been interpreted through a lens of empathy. The empath would try to understand the reasons behind the behavior, often giving the benefit of the doubt and filling in emotional gaps with hope. But now, instead of explaining the behavior away, they see it for what it is, a pattern, and patterns are revealing. When someone shows up fully one day and withdraws the next, that inconsistency is no longer romanticized as complexity. It's recognized as misalignment. The healed empath doesn't ignore the connection, they simply stop ignoring the evidence. They allow actions to speak louder than intentions, and in doing so, they gain a level of clarity that wasn't accessible before. This is where the illusion begins to fade, because without the empath overcompensating, there's nothing left to sustain a one-sided dynamic. The avoidance behavior becomes more visible, more defined. If they continue to pull away, it's no longer softened by someone chasing after them. If they make an effort, it stands out more clearly because it's not being carried by the other person's energy. Everything becomes easier to read, and with that clarity comes a quiet but important question. Is there room for growth here? Not imagined growth, not hoped for change, but actual observable effort. Is the avoidant showing signs of leaning in? Even if slowly, are they becoming more consistent, more communicative, more willing to meet in the middle? Or are they staying within the same patterns, offering just enough to keep the connection alive, but not enough to build something stable? The healed empath pays attention to this, not with urgency, but with awareness, because growth requires participation from both people. It's not enough for one person to be ready, open, and emotionally available. If the other remains guarded, distant, or unwilling to engage beyond a certain point, then the situation is not in a position to proceed. The connection cannot evolve no matter how strong the initial attraction was. This realization doesn't come with drama. It comes with calm acceptance. The empath no longer feels the need to force progress or initiate difficult conversations just to create movement. They understand that real change reveals itself through consistent action over time. And if that action isn't there, the answer becomes clear without needing to be spoken. So, the dynamic moves out of confusion and into truth. Either both people begin to meet each other in a more balanced, intentional way, or the gap between them becomes undeniable. And in that space, there is no longer a question of what if, only what is. At a certain point, the healed empath stops being captivated by what could happen and becomes grounded in what is actually happening. This is a profound shift because so much of the earlier attraction often lived in possibility, the idea of who the other person might become, how the connection might evolve, or what it could feel like if everything finally aligned. Potential can be intoxicating. It allows you to overlook gaps, excuse inconsistency, and stay emotionally invested in something that hasn't fully materialized. But the healed empath no longer builds relationships on imagination. They pay attention to patterns instead of promises. If someone says they care, but their actions are inconsistent, the empath doesn't cling to the words, they observe the behavior. If someone expresses interest but disappears for days, weeks, that absence is not explained away or minimized. It's acknowledged as part of the reality of the connection. Consistency for the healed empath becomes non-negotiable, not perfection, not constant attention, but a steady, reliable presence that doesn't leave them questioning where they stand. They value communication that doesn't fluctuate based on mood or convenience. They notice whether effort is sustained or only appears in moments when the other person feels like re-engaging. And most importantly, they trust what repeated behavior shows them over time. This doesn't mean they become rigid or closed off. They are still open, still capable of deep connection, still willing to explore something meaningful. But their openness is now anchored in discernment. They are no longer swept away by emotional highs that are followed by confusing lows. Instead, they look for stability, the kind of connection that feels calm, clear, and grounded. Choosing reality over potential also means letting go of timelines that don't match their needs. If someone says, "I'm not ready right now," the healed empath doesn't wait indefinitely for that to change. They don't put their life on hold in the hope that one day things will be different. They respect the honesty, but they also respect themselves enough to move towards something that exists in the present, not just in the future. There's a quiet confidence in this approach. They no longer feel the need to convince someone to show up. They don't try to inspire effort or prove their worth in order to be chosen. If the connection requires them to question their value, they recognize that as a misalignment, not a challenge to overcome. And this is where their power lies. Because by prioritizing consistency and reality, they remove themselves from cycles that thrive on uncertainty. They stop investing in half-formed connections and start creating space for relationships that are mutual, stable, and emotionally available. In doing so, they redefine what love looks like, not something you chase, but something that meets you clearly, consistently, and without confusion. At the deepest level, real connection stops being about effort and starts being about emotional availability on both sides, not performance, not intensity, not how much someone can endure or how hard they can try, but whether two people are actually present with each other in a stable, honest way. When a healed empath reaches this stage, their entire framework for relationships changes. They are no longer impressed by emotional highs that come and go. They don't confuse passion with compatibility or distance with depth. Instead, they begin to recognize something far more important: whether the connection feels safe enough to be real and steady enough to grow. True connection doesn't thrive in confusion. It thrives in clarity. It's not built on guessing where you stand, decoding mixed signals, or waiting for someone to decide when they feel ready. It is built on mutual presence, two people showing up consistently, without one person having to carry the emotional weight of the relationship. And this is where the healed empath becomes very clear. They are open, but not available to inconsistency. They are loving, but not willing to self-abandon for love. They are understanding, but no longer willing to overextend themselves just to keep something alive that isn't being equally nurtured. This is not emotional withdrawal, it is emotional alignment. They begin to understand that effort alone is not proof of love. Someone can care deeply and still be unable or unwilling to show up in a consistent way. But love, in its healthiest form, doesn't leave the other person constantly questioning it. It doesn't require interpretation or emotional guessing games. It reveals itself through steady action. And when both people meet each other in that fully present, emotionally available, and willing to maintain consistency, the connection becomes entirely different. There is no chase, no imbalance, no emotional whiplash between closeness and distance. Instead, there is calm recognition. You don't have to convince someone to stay engaged. You don't have to shrink yourself to keep them close. You don't have to overanalyze silence or overvalue occasional attention. Everything is clear because it is lived, not assumed. For the healed empath, this is the standard they begin to hold, not as a demand, but as self-respect. If someone cannot meet them there, they don't try to drag them into alignment. They simply step back. Not out of punishment, but out of understanding that meaningful connection cannot be one-sided. And in doing so, they make space for something rare but real. A relationship where both people are emotionally available, equally invested, and no longer operating from fear, avoidance, or overgiving. That is where love stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like truth. In the end, the meeting between an avoidant and a healed empath is not just a relationship dynamic, it becomes a reflection of emotional maturity on both sides. What begins as attraction shaped by contrast slowly reveals the deeper truth beneath it. One person learning to sit with emotional presence and the other learning to stop abandoning themselves in the name of connection. The healed empath no longer enters these dynamics looking to fix, chase, or decode someone. They enter with awareness. And awareness changes everything because it removes illusion and replaces it with clarity. As the dynamic unfolds, the empath's transformation becomes the central shift in the story. They no longer operate from emotional urgency or the need to be chosen quickly. Instead, they allow time and behavior to reveal what words often hide. This patience is not passive, it is intentional. It allows the avoidance patterns to surface without interference, and it allows the empath to see whether there is genuine capacity for connection or just temporary engagement. In doing so, they step out of confusion and into discernment. Meanwhile, the avoidant is no longer protected by the empath's overgiving or emotional chasing. Without that safety net, they are left alone with their own patterns, distance, withdrawal, and emotional hesitation. This creates a natural mirror effect. Either they begin to recognize their own behavior and slowly lean into growth, or they retreat further into familiarity. There is no force, no persuasion, no emotional bargaining, only truth revealed through action. And that truth is often uncomfortable, but necessary. What becomes most powerful in this entire dynamic is the shift from potential-based connection to reality-based connection. The healed empath no longer invests in what someone might become, but in what they consistently show. This removes the emotional instability that once defined such relationships. Instead of highs and lows, there is either steady progress or clear misalignment. And both outcomes bring clarity rather than confusion. In this space, love is no longer measured by intensity, but by consistency and presence. Ultimately, the conclusion is simple but deeply grounding. Real connection cannot survive imbalance. It requires two emotionally available people choosing each other in the present moment, not one person waiting, hoping, or overgiving while the other remains distant. The healed empath walks away from uncertainty, not because they lack care, but because they have finally learned to care for themselves with the same depth they once offered others. And in that decision, they stop seeking relationships that drain them and begin allowing only those that meet them fully, honestly, and without hesitation. Thank you for taking the time to go through this journey of understanding emotional dynamics on a deeper level. Growth in love and relationships is never just about finding the right person, it's about becoming someone who no longer loses themselves in the wrong patterns. If this message helped you see things more clearly, then its purpose has already been fulfilled. As you move forward, carry this awareness with you. Real connection doesn't require you to chase, convince, or overgive. It meets you where you are, stays consistent with its actions, and grows through mutual presence, not emotional confusion. Let go of what drains you, and don't be afraid to choose peace over potential. Goodbye for now, and take care of your energy, your heart, and your standards.